The call to action. Marcus James wasn't a man who typically let emotions dictate his actions. For the past 15 years, he had built a reputation as one of the best surgeons in Brooklyn. At the age of 36, his expertise had saved countless lives, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of the situation he was facing tonight. His phone buzzed urgently in his pocket, a familiar but dreaded sound that indicated a life-or-death situation. It was just past midnight, and most of the city was asleep, but Marcus had long learned that emergencies didn't care about the time on the clock. He quickly pulled the phone from his pocket and read the message. The words froze his blood. Code red. Young girl, 7 years old, critical condition. We need you now. He read the message again. The urgency in the words sent a shiver through his spine. He barely had time to process the request before his brain switched into overdrive. There was no time for hesitation, a little girl's life was on the line. He threw his jacket on the back of a chair and grabbed his bag. Inside, his surgical instruments, prepared in advance for emergencies, seemed almost like an extension of himself. But this wasn't just any emergency. This was different. This time, the little girl who needed saving was the daughter of one of the local cops. The pressure of knowing who her father was only intensified the gravity of the situation. Marcus couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not tonight. He hurried out of his apartment, the familiar streets of Brooklyn now feeling like a maze of obstacles between him and the hospital. His heartbeat quickened as the urgency of the moment settled deeper in his chest. As a surgeon, he had seen it all: heart attacks, car accidents, gunshot wounds, and countless other life-threatening conditions. But there was something about this particular situation that sent his mind racing faster than usual. The girl's father was a cop, and Marcus knew all too well how high the stakes could be when a law enforcement officer's family was involved. There was no room for error, no time to question the decisions being made. This wasn't just about saving a life, it was about proving that even in a world filled with chaos, there was still hope. Marcus sped through the city streets, the bright lights of the skyscrapers reflecting off his rear-view mirror. Every second counted. He couldn't afford to get caught in traffic, and he couldn't afford to let his mind wander. The only thing that mattered now was getting to the hospital. As he neared the entrance, Marcus saw the familiar sight of the emergency room lights flashing in the distance. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. He had to be at his best, no matter what. The hospital was just a few blocks away when his heart sank. Ahead of him, a group of police cars had gathered near an intersection. The flashing lights, the sirens, and the tense energy of the officers standing around in their uniforms made his stomach churn. He needed to get through, and fast. Without hesitation, Marcus swerved his car around the corner, narrowly avoiding the blocked intersection. The adrenaline pumping through his veins drowned out everything else. He had only one thing on his mind now: the little girl who needed him. But as Marcus sped down the street, he didn't notice the patrol car following closely behind. It wasn't until he was almost at the hospital's entrance that the lights began to flash, and the sirens pierced the night air. "Not now," Marcus muttered under his breath. He pulled over to the side of the road, frustrated but doing his best to remain calm. He knew the drill. As a doctor in a city as chaotic as Brooklyn, he had been stopped by police before. It was annoying, but it was always part of the job. He threw his car into park and rolled down the window. "License and registration," a voice called from outside. Marcus didn't have time for this. He looked at the officer in the rearview mirror, his voice barely containing the urgency. "I'm a surgeon. There's a little girl in critical condition, and I need to get to the hospital. Please, just let me through." The officer, a tall man with a stern expression, didn't budge. "Step out of the car, sir." Marcus felt the pressure building, his frustration mounting. His thoughts were already with the little girl who needed him, and he didn't have time for this nonsense. But the officer was firm, his stance unwavering. Now. Marcus exhaled sharply and opened the door. He stepped out of the car, trying to keep his composure. I don't have time for this. Someone is going to die if I don't get to the hospital in the next few minutes. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for another officer to approach. Within moments, Marcus found himself surrounded by police, and his heart began to race even faster. It was clear that they had no idea who he was, or why he was in such a hurry. You're under arrest for resisting an officer, the first cop said, his voice cold. Put your hands behind your back. Marcus felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He couldn't afford to get arrested. Not now. Not when everything depended on him. But the officers didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. Instead, they moved in to cuff him, laughing and joking amongst themselves as if this was some kind of game. The mockery in their voices only fueled Marcus' sense of helplessness. And then, just as he was about to be handcuffed, everything changed. The officer standing closest to him suddenly froze, his eyes widening in recognition. Wait, the officer said, his voice faltering. You're Dr. Marcus James, aren't you? Marcus didn't have time to answer. The man's expression shifted from one of casual indifference to something far more serious. The officer's gaze flickered nervously toward the other officers, his tone now laced with genuine concern. You're the surgeon, the one they called for the little girl, aren't you? Marcus felt a surge of frustration. Yes, he said sharply. I'm the one who can save her. Now, get these handcuffs off me so I can do my job. The officer's face turned pale, and for the first time, Marcus saw the human side of the man who had been treating him like a criminal just moments earlier. Oh my God, the officer muttered under his breath. That little girl, she's my daughter. The weight of those words hit Marcus harder than anything he had ever experienced. The realization of who he was dealing with sent shockwaves through the air, and all at once, everything seemed to change, the turning point. Marcus felt the officer's words hit him like a thunderclap. The shock and urgency in the man's voice stirred something deep inside him, but it also intensified his anxiety. He was dealing with a father now, not just a law enforcement officer. The man in front of him wasn't just stopping him because of protocol or suspicion, he was stopping him because his daughter's life was on the line. The officer's face had turned pale, and Marcus could see the tremor in his hands as they lowered from his holster. His earlier bravado had melted away, replaced with a profound vulnerability that no badge or uniform could disguise. The officer's eyes, once cold and unyielding, were now filled with a quiet horror. For the first time, Marcus saw the officer as a man, not just a symbol of the law. Marcus held the officer's gaze for a long moment, his mind whirling. He understood what the officer was feeling. He had seen it in the eyes of countless parents, spouses, and family members who had come to him in fear, praying for a miracle. In that instant, Marcus realized that this wasn't just about one child's life. This was about all the hopes and fears a parent carried within them. This was personal now. But there was no time for sympathy, no time to dwell on what the officer must be going through. Marcus had learned long ago that the moment you let yourself get distracted by emotion, the patient suffers. And this child, this little girl, needed him to focus. More than anything, she needed him to act. His voice was firm, but there was a quiet desperation underneath. We need to get to the hospital now. I don't care about anything else. Time is critical. The officer took a slow step back, still processing the realization that his daughter's life was in the hands of the very man he had just tried to arrest. He swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between Marcus and the other officers who had gathered around them. God, I'm sorry. I didn't know. The officer's voice cracked, and he stepped aside, nodding toward the hospital in the distance. Go. Get there. I'll make sure nothing else gets in your way. Without another word, Marcus stepped past him, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked, he could feel the weight of the officer's apology lingering in the air. The officer's words hung in the silence, but Marcus couldn't afford to dwell on them. His legs moved faster now, the long strides of a man who had a singular purpose. As he neared his car, Marcus noticed the other officers had fallen silent. They had all witnessed the change in their colleague, the sudden shift in power dynamics, and they understood the gravity of the situation. They had been part of the problem, but now, they would be part of the solution. Marcus felt their eyes on his back as he climbed into his car, but he couldn't spare a glance in return. There was nothing left to say. The engine roared to life, and Marcus sped off toward the hospital once more, his hands steady on the wheel. He could feel the police presence now working in his favor. No one would dare stop him again. The sirens that had once seemed like an obstacle now felt like an escort, guiding him toward the one place that could save the little girl's life. As Marcus drove, his thoughts raced. His mind flashed back to his training, to the countless hours spent in surgical theater, to the sterile smell of the operating room. He had performed surgeries under pressure before, but this was different. This wasn't just about the technical aspects of surgery, this was about a life that had personal stakes for someone who was supposed to be his adversary, someone who had once been part of the system that made his life as difficult as it sometimes was. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting to that hospital and making sure the little girl would have a chance to see another day. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the head nurse at the hospital. "Dr. James, the child is in severe distress. We need you now. The surgeon on call isn't experienced enough to handle this case, and she's slipping fast. Please hurry." Marcus's grip on the wheel tightened. His fingers dug into the leather as his mind absorbed the gravity of the situation. The girl was slipping. She was running out of time. He could feel the seconds ticking by like a countdown in his head, each one pushing him further toward the brink. But as much as the weight of the moment pressed down on him, Marcus couldn't afford to lose his focus. He had to stay calm. He had to remember his training, his hands, and his mind. All of it had been honed for moments like these. The hospital was just ahead, and it was time to put his years of experience to work. He would save this little girl's life, no matter the cost. As he reached the hospital entrance, he could see the flashing lights of the emergency room. The doors swung open as he pulled up, and nurses and doctors were already waiting for him. They knew the drill, they had seen Marcus walk in under these kinds of circumstances before. He was known for his calm under pressure, for his ability to handle any situation with the precision and care that the most delicate surgeries demanded. Marcus stepped out of the car, his heart pounding. He barely spared a glance at the officers who had followed him here, their silent support almost tangible as they stood at the entrance, watching him move toward the doors. One of the officers, the one who had realized that the little girl was his daughter, was still by his side, his expression filled with both fear and gratitude. He didn't say a word, but his presence was an unspoken pledge of support. Inside the hospital, the sterile white walls seemed to close in on Marcus as he rushed toward the operating room. He could hear the faint beeping of machines in the distance, the sound of a life hanging in the balance. His mind was in a whirlwind, but he had to focus. He had done this 1,000 times before, and he could do it again. This little girl, this officer's daughter, was depending on him to pull her back from the edge. The operating room was ready when he arrived, the team of doctors and nurses waiting for him. They had already prepped the child, but it was clear that this was not going to be an easy procedure. The girl's vital signs were unstable, and there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. Marcus didn't waste a second. He immediately took control of the situation, his hands moving with practiced precision as he began the delicate process of stabilizing the child. His mind was clear, despite the chaos swirling around him. This was what he had trained for, what he had sacrificed so much for. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think of the officer, standing outside the door, waiting for word on his daughter's fate. Marcus understood what it meant to be a parent, and the weight of the officer's anxiety was not lost on him. They were connected in a way that went beyond profession. Tonight, they were both fathers, and they both had something precious to protect. With each passing minute, the operation became more intense. Marcus's hands never faltered as he worked tirelessly, his focus unwavering. The little girl's life was in his hands now, and there was no room for mistakes. As the hours dragged on, Marcus knew that this was more than just a surgery, it was a race against time, a battle for a life that had barely begun. And in that battle, Marcus wasn't just fighting for a patient. He was fighting for the hope of a father who was desperately praying that his daughter would survive. The outcome of this surgery was yet to be seen, but Marcus was determined. No matter what happened, he would do everything in his power to save this little girl. After all, she wasn't just a patient to him, she was a symbol of something much bigger, something that connected them all. And so, Marcus kept going, one precise movement after another, until the weight of the world finally shifted, and the little girl's heartbeat began to stabilize. The battle for life. The operating room was a sanctuary of sterile precision, the rhythmic beeping of machines marking the seconds that stretched into what felt like an eternity. Marcus's hands worked with the steady, practiced grace of a surgeon who had performed hundreds of similar operations, but this one felt different. This wasn't just any surgery, it was the surgery. The surgery that would either deliver a child back into the world or condemn her to an early death. Every movement, every decision, was amplified by the knowledge that her father, the officer who had detained him just hours earlier, was waiting outside, praying for a miracle. Marcus blocked out everything but the task at hand. He couldn't afford to think about the officer, his daughter, or the complicated emotions that swirled in the air. He had been in life-and-death situations before, but this one felt more like a test of something deeper, something beyond his surgical skill. The eyes of the officer, and, by extension, the hopes of a father, rested on his hands. But even so, Marcus was calm. He had to be. He had trained for years, developed an almost instinctual understanding of anatomy, of physiology, of the human body. The rest was just noise. He couldn't afford to let anything, including his own emotions, distract him now. The child on the operating table was barely 7, her small body vulnerable and fragile as the team worked quickly to stabilize her. The clock was ticking. It was a rare condition, a burst appendix that had gone unnoticed for too long, resulting in peritonitis, a life-threatening infection. By the time she arrived at the hospital, she was in septic shock. Her tiny body was fighting a battle on two fronts, one against the infection, and the other against the weight of time. Marcus worked methodically, his fingers deftly moving in a precise choreography, cutting through tissue with the kind of care that only years of experience could afford. His team was in sync with him, everyone moving together like parts of a well-oiled machine, responding instantly to his every command, anticipating his next step. Outside the operating room, the officer stood vigil. He had given Marcus space to work, but he hadn't left. There was no way he could. As a father, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. He had tried to go to the waiting room, to sit and wait like any other parent, but he couldn't stand to be that far from his daughter. So he paced outside the door, his thoughts a chaotic blend of fear, guilt, and hope. The officer's mind was in turmoil. He had never expected to be in this position, never expected to be the one waiting while a stranger, a doctor he had just tried to arrest, fought for the life of his daughter. He could still remember the shock on Marcus's face when he realized who the little girl was. The officer could barely comprehend how things had escalated so quickly from the point of pulling Marcus over to now, when everything hinged on this one moment. The same hands that had been moments ago securing him in cuffs were now the very hands that could save his daughter. It was a bitter pill for the officer to swallow. He had always seen doctors as a separate world, a world that functioned alongside the law but didn't belong to it. And now, here he was, counting on a man who had been his adversary not hours ago to be his family's savior. There was no room for pride, no room for ego. In that moment, the officer realized something crucial: in the grand scheme of things, no one was invincible. No badge or uniform could protect you from the vulnerability of love, the raw fear of losing someone you cherished more than anything in the world. His thoughts drifted, though he tried to keep them tethered to the present. He found himself imagining the quiet moments he had spent with his daughter, her laughter, her endless curiosity, the way her eyes would light up when she spoke of her dreams of becoming a scientist. The officer had always been strict, focused on maintaining order, but his daughter had a way of drawing him out of his shell. She was the one who could bring him joy without even trying. And now, she was in there, fighting for her life. He couldn't bear to think of what would happen if Marcus wasn't able to pull her through. But there was something about Marcus, something about the way he had carried himself. He had been calm, even when the officer had been so quick to judge him, so certain that the doctor was just another arrogant, self-absorbed person. But now, Marcus had proven otherwise. It wasn't just his skill as a surgeon that impressed the officer, it was his unwavering focus in the face of adversity. Marcus wasn't working for accolades or recognition. He was working for the girl, for the officer's daughter, because that was his job. To save lives. No matter who it was. The officer's phone buzzed in his pocket, jerking him from his thoughts. He pulled it out quickly, expecting another message from the hospital staff. But instead, it was a simple message from his wife, her words brief but powerful. "How is she?" He stared at the screen, the words heavy on his chest. He couldn't bring himself to respond. The truth was, he didn't know how she was. He didn't know if she would make it. He didn't know anything anymore. He only knew that he was standing here, waiting, praying that the doctor inside could save her. The door to the operating room opened slightly, and a nurse stuck her head out. The officer's heart skipped a beat. His breath hitched as he stepped toward the door. "How is she?" he asked, his voice tight, betraying the fear he had kept bottled up. The nurse hesitated for just a moment before answering. "We're stabilizing her. It's touch and go. Dr. James is still in there." The officer's heart sank, but he nodded. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear that it was still uncertain. He wanted to know that his daughter was going to be okay, that she would wake up and call out for him. That they would go home together, like they always had. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus had removed the infected appendix, but the damage had been extensive. The peritonitis had spread further than he'd anticipated, and the child's body was reacting violently. There was still hope, there was always hope, but the longer the surgery continued, the more tenuous that hope became. The surgical team was working tirelessly, but Marcus felt the pressure mounting with every second. He could hear the soft clicks of the monitors, the hiss of the oxygen tank, the scuffle of nurses' feet as they moved to adjust equipment. But it was the quiet, focused tension in the air that spoke volumes. Every second was a battle. His mind raced through the options. He could see the infection spreading in front of him, and his brain quickly calculated the best course of action. His hand was steady as he administered the final round of antibiotics into the child's system, hoping it would be enough to counteract the damage. He couldn't afford to think about anything else. This wasn't about what had happened earlier that night, or even about the officer waiting outside, it was about this little girl, her life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The clock on the wall seemed to taunt Marcus, reminding him that every second brought them closer to a crisis point. But in the midst of the chaos, he remained calm. He knew that panic could not save this girl. Only precision, determination, and focus could. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the beeping of the monitor slowed down. The rapid, erratic rhythm was replaced by a more consistent, steady pulse. Marcus held his breath, staring at the numbers flickering on the screen. The child was holding on. She was fighting. Vitals are stabilizing, the nurse said, her voice steady, but Marcus could hear the relief underneath. She's responding. Marcus allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, but only a brief one. He wasn't finished yet. But it was a start. The little girl was still in the fight, and so was he. Outside the operating room, the officer's phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He opened the message immediately. She's stable. For now. They're saying we can breathe for a while. The officer read the words, the weight of them sinking into his chest like a heavy stone. His daughter wasn't out of the woods yet, but she was fighting. She was alive. And for the first time that night, the officer allowed himself to hope again. He stood outside the door, his mind still racing with worry. But this time, it wasn't just the fear of losing his daughter that gripped him. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the man inside who had, against all odds, chosen to save a life, his daughter's life, when no one else could. And for the first time that night, he understood the true meaning of being a father, the silent struggle. The hours after the surgery were a blur. For Marcus, the world outside the operating room faded into the background, replaced by the sterile hum of machinery and the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the hospital. The little girl was stable, but that stability was fragile, nothing was certain. The infection could return, complications could arise, and her tiny body was already exhausted from the battle it had fought. Still, Marcus was cautiously optimistic. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a step forward. He had done what he could, and for now, that was enough. He needed to stay vigilant, to keep the girl under close monitoring, but there was a small part of him that allowed himself to rest, if only for a moment. He stepped away from the patient's bedside and let the nurse take over while he went to check in with the officer. Outside the operating room, the officer had remained steadfast in his position. He hadn't moved, hadn't left his post. The waiting room was empty save for him. He had seen families come and go throughout the night, some with worried looks, some with tears of relief, but he couldn't bring himself to join them. He couldn't sit in a chair, hoping for good news, when he could be doing something. Anything. His mind swirled with questions. Would his daughter wake up? Would she remember the pain? What if she didn't make it through the night? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft opening of the operating room door. Marcus emerged, his face set in the stoic expression that had become his trademark over the years. His eyes were tired, but there was something there, something that told the officer that the worst had passed, at least for now. "How is she?" the officer asked, his voice breaking through the tension that hung in the air between them. Marcus paused, studying the officer for a moment before answering. The man's body language was telling, his shoulders tense and his posture rigid. He could see the fear behind the officer's carefully guarded expression, the same fear that had driven him to stop Marcus earlier in the night, the same fear that had brought him here to wait, despite the circumstances. Marcus could tell that the man had aged a few years in the span of a few hours. "She's stable for now," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. He knew the officer needed hope, but he also didn't want to offer false promises. "We've got her through the worst of it. The infection's been controlled, but she's not out of the woods yet. We'll have to monitor her closely over the next few hours." The officer's breath hitched, and his hand gripped the side of the wall for support. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but Marcus saw it. He understood the weight of what those words meant. He was a father, too, and he knew what it felt like to hear the worst while still clinging to the hope that things could change. "You did it," the officer murmured. His voice cracked, the emotions that had been building up inside him finally breaking through. "You saved her." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained neutral. "I did my job. She's not out of danger yet, but I'll stay on top of her. She's strong, and that's what we need right now." The officer nodded slowly, as if to reassure himself. He wanted to believe Marcus, wanted to hold on to the hope that his daughter would make it. But there was still a part of him that couldn't fully relax, couldn't let go of the dread that still hovered over him. As the officer stood there, silent and distant, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of kinship. Despite the complicated nature of their earlier interaction, despite the tension that had defined their relationship until now, Marcus understood the officer better than anyone else in that moment. They were both fathers, driven by love, by a need to protect. The fear in the officer's eyes was the same fear that lived in every parent who had ever been faced with the uncertainty of their child's survival. It was the kind of fear that had no room for pride, for ego, or for anything other than raw, overwhelming love. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, aware that they were both standing in an uncertain silence. He had done what he could, but there was more work to be done. It was time to check on the girl once again. "Come with me," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "I'll let you see her." The officer hesitated for a moment, as if the offer was too much to bear. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he nodded and followed Marcus down the corridor. They walked side by side, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls, the air heavy with unspoken words. As they approached the room, Marcus glanced at the officer, noting the way his face softened when they reached the door. It was as though, just for a moment, the officer was no longer a lawman, no longer a man who had been hardened by years of service and struggle. He was just a father, standing at the threshold of his daughter's room, unsure of what he would find. Marcus opened the door and stepped inside, and the officer followed. The little girl lay in the bed, surrounded by machines that monitored her every breath. Her small frame was hooked up to an IV drip, a heart monitor, and an oxygen mask. She looked peaceful for the moment, as if she were asleep rather than fighting for her life. Marcus couldn't help but feel a pang of hope at the sight of her steady breathing, but he knew that the next few hours were critical. Her recovery was still uncertain. The officer stood at the foot of the bed, staring down at his daughter. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, and his eyes were fixed on her face. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything he had been through in the past few hours. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The officer's gaze never left his daughter, his expression unreadable. Marcus watched him closely, giving him the space he needed to process everything that had happened. There was nothing else Marcus could say. He had done what he could, and now, it was up to the little girl to fight. And, in a way, it was up to her father, too. The officer eventually moved closer to the bed, his hand hovering above his daughter's small, fragile hand. Slowly, he reached out and touched it, as if the simple gesture could somehow make everything right again. He felt the warmth of her skin under his fingertips, and for the first time in hours, his body seemed to relax, if only slightly. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." Marcus stood quietly, watching the officer as he leaned down to kiss his daughter's forehead. There was no judgment in the room, no animosity. There was only the quiet hum of the machines, the rhythmic breathing of the child, and the unspoken understanding between two men who had both been driven to the edge of their endurance. The officer looked up at Marcus, his eyes filled with a gratitude that was both raw and intense. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." Marcus shook his head, his expression unchanged. "You don't need to. I'm just doing my job. What matters now is that she makes it through." The officer nodded again, but this time, there was something different in his posture. He wasn't just standing there, waiting for the worst to happen. He was there, truly present, for his daughter. And Marcus knew that, whatever happened, this man, this father, would fight with everything he had for the life of his little girl. As the minutes stretched into hours, the officer stood vigil by his daughter's side, his silent presence a promise that he would not leave her. The bond between father and child, forged in the crucible of fear and uncertainty, was unbreakable. For Marcus, it was a reminder of why he did what he did. Why he sacrificed so much of his own life for others, because in the end, it wasn't just about medicine or skill. It was about the lives you touched, the families you saved, and the connections you made in moments of crisis. In that room, Marcus saw not just a patient in her father, but the humanity that tied them all together. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in hours, Marcus allowed himself to hope. He allowed himself to believe that the little girl lying in the bed, so close to death just a few hours ago, might just make it after all. The thin line between hope and despair. The night stretched on, and with each passing hour, the tension in the hospital grew thicker. For Marcus, the fatigue was creeping in, yet his focus remained sharp. Every part of his being was attuned to the little girl in room 306, the one he had fought to save. Her condition was still precarious, but the fact that she was holding on, even against the odds, kept Marcus pushing forward. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not yet. Not until she was out of danger. Outside the room, the officer had not moved. He sat in a chair beside the bed, his eyes fixed on his daughter's face. Every few minutes, he would glance at the monitors, watch her chest rise and fall, and search for any signs of improvement. But despite the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft rhythm of the ventilator, the officer couldn't shake the gnawing fear that still clung to him like a shadow. His thoughts kept spiraling, as they had all night. What if the infection flared up again? What if Marcus had missed something? What if it was too late? The officer found himself battling not just fear, but guilt. It was a struggle he hadn't expected to face when he had first become a father. The guilt of not being there when his daughter needed him most, of not seeing the signs of her illness earlier, weighed heavily on him. He had always been the protector, the one in control, and now he found himself vulnerable in a way he had never imagined. And it made him question everything. But his daughter was still alive, and that was the only truth that mattered. He had to hold on to that. Marcus checked in on her again, his eyes scanning the charts on the wall. It wasn't just about the physical aspects anymore, he had to look at her as a whole. The surgery had gone well, and the infection appeared to be under control for now, but the critical hours following such a procedure were always the most dangerous. He felt the weight of the decision to allow her father to stay with her. Most families would have been ushered out, for fear that too much emotional stress might interfere with a child's recovery, but something had felt different in this case. The officer was needed, and Marcus knew it. The presence of a parent who refused to leave their child's side could sometimes be the greatest medicine of all. The officer had insisted on staying, though, and Marcus respected that. He watched the man now, seated beside the bed, eyes never leaving his daughter's face. There was no arrogance in his posture now, only weariness and the quiet, unspoken promise of love. The quiet hum of the hospital seemed to match the slow pulse of the officer's thoughts. Every so often, he would lean forward, his face filled with quiet determination, as though willing his daughter to wake up, to open her eyes and look at him, and for everything to go back to normal. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a typical night at the hospital. It wasn't just another shift. This time, everything was at stake. The officer couldn't stop his mind from wandering back to the moment when he had first detained Marcus. The man had been running late, he had been in a rush to get to the hospital, and he had been stopped by a cop who didn't know him. The officer had mocked him, made jokes about him being in a hurry, not knowing who Marcus was, what he was capable of. It was a foolish mistake, one he regretted deeply now. He couldn't go back and change what had happened, but he could try to make it right now. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing his thoughts to settle, his heart to slow. He was doing the only thing he could do, being here. For her. For his daughter. And now, the only thing left to do was to wait. Just then, the soft click of the door opening interrupted the stillness. Marcus stepped in again, looking as calm and composed as ever. The officer looked up, but his gaze softened when he saw the doctor's expression. It wasn't the grim face he had expected. Instead, Marcus was still wearing a quiet look of determination, hope, even, despite the exhaustion he was clearly feeling. "How's she doing?" the officer asked, his voice low. "She's holding steady," Marcus replied, walking over to the monitors again, taking a moment to study the numbers. "We've kept the infection under control. Her vitals are stable for now, but we need to keep her here for at least another day for observation." The officer nodded, but the words didn't bring him as much relief as he had hoped. "But she's going to make it?" Marcus paused for a beat. He looked at the officer with a glance that was part reassurance and part pragmatism. "She's strong. I believe she can make it through this, but we'll have to keep a close eye on her. It's still too soon to say." The officer's shoulders sagged a little, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. They weren't promises, and the officer had learned not to trust false assurances. He had seen enough death and suffering in his line of work to know that not every story ended the way you wanted. But still, there was a flicker of hope deep within him, a small ember that had been reignited since he had first seen his daughter's stable heart rate. Marcus could see the uncertainty in the officer's eyes. He knew the man wasn't asking for promises, but for some semblance of control in a situation that was beyond his control. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on the officer's shoulder, an unspoken connection between two men who were, in this moment, not so different. "She's fighting. And you're here. That counts for something," Marcus said quietly. "You just have to trust her, and trust that we're doing everything we can." The officer nodded slowly, but his gaze never left his daughter. His eyes seemed locked on her, as though willing her to open her eyes, to smile at him again, to tell him that everything was going to be okay. He didn't have any magic words. All he could do was be here, as the quiet hours passed in the sterile glow of the hospital room. Marcus lingered for a moment longer, watching the officer in silence. The soft sound of the ventilator filling the room was almost too loud in the stillness, and Marcus took one last look at the little girl before quietly stepping back. "I'll check in on her again in a couple of hours," Marcus said, his voice steady. "If anything changes, you'll be the first to know." "Thank you," the officer responded, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you enough." Marcus gave a small nod, though he didn't speak. The officer's gratitude was evident in his eyes, but Marcus knew better than to let emotions cloud the task at hand. There was still work to be done. And for now, the best thing they could both do was wait. Outside the room, Marcus found himself lingering for a moment in the hallway, his eyes moving over the sterile environment. The hospital felt like a world of its own, separated from the outside world by the cold, fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of voices in the distance. His thoughts drifted to his own family, to his own daughter, though he rarely had time to spend with her these days. The demands of his profession didn't leave room for much else. But tonight, he had been reminded of something. That despite the pressure, the long hours, and the sacrifices, it was the moments like these that truly mattered. The moments when a child's life hung in the balance, and the moments when a father, desperate for answers, leaned on a doctor for help. Marcus understood that now. And though the outcome of this battle was still uncertain, he knew that in his heart, he had given everything he had to help this little girl. And for now, that was enough. As the officer sat in the chair, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face, he couldn't help but think of how life could change in an instant. The reality of what had happened hit him all over again, the life he had taken for granted, the love he had nearly lost. He could never undo the mistakes of the past, but he had the chance to be here now, to stay by his daughter's side. And in that moment, despite the uncertainty that still loomed, both the officer and Marcus understood the same truth, that the fight for life was never over, not as long as there was still love to hold on to.